You know how there's some authors where you read a couple books and you immediately know you're going to have to read every single book they've ever written. And then there's certain authors that you read a book, you like it, you read some more, and pretty soon it starts to slowly dawn on you that that might be your favorite author of all time. Let's talk a little bit about everything from column A, a little bit from column B. Hi, I'm Nick Hill with Shelf-Esteem. Let's talk about my top 10 favorite authors of all time, at least as of 2024. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Nick Hill with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer and now also booktuber. You can find my music in The Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Material Season 3, and the official Brent Week's companion album for his series, Lightbringer. So I figured, I'm on vacation right now at the time that you're going to be watching this, and I wanted to kind of post more content while I'm out of town. So I figured this was kind of the perfect video that I could speak a little bit more on. Talk about authors maybe you've heard a lot about, maybe authors that you're not too familiar with, but 10 authors that really resonated with me. Now, I want to caveat a couple things, first of all. This is kind of a personal list in the sense that this is not like a definitive top 10 of all time. Of course, that's a very subjective list, and everyone's going to have their own top 10 for very variety of reasons. Everyone reads different types of genres, right? I've kind of made my channel's focus more of the fantasy, sci-fi, horror and historical fiction genres. So those are kind of my primary focuses. That's the stuff I really love reading. So my top 10 is going to be very heavy in those categories. But yours may differ. And I would love to know in the comments after this video, if you have a top 10 and kind of why you like them, because I find that the dialogue of being able to discover books together and authors together is what makes this channel so great, what makes BookTube so great. So please let me know in the comments because it's fun to chat about it. Where we agree, where we differ in opinion, that's always really fun for me. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. And then the second caveat is I wanted to kind of do some honorable mentions because there's certain authors that I've read a couple books, I really love them, and I could see them being on my top 10, but it's still a little early in the phase of, my reading journey with them. So I kind of made the cutoff that I have to have read at least 3 books from that author to be able to make a definitive decision one way or another if they get into the top 10 or not. So this is a 2024 list. Of course, I'm going to update this every year, and these things are going to change. They're going to move around, and I get the feeling I've discovered so many great authors this year that this list is going to vary significantly from year to year. So I'm really looking forward to being able to talk about that with you. So without further ado, let's get into some honorable mentions. So again, like I mentioned, these are authors that I think are absolutely top 10 worthy, but I just haven't read enough of their work yet to make it a definitive decision one way or another. So let's jump into the first honorable mention, and that is Ken Follett. So Ken Follett, I just discovered this year. I've expounded upon his works quite a bit on this channel, so you probably already, if you're not new to this channel, if you've seen any of my videos, probably heard me talk about him ad nauseum at this point. But he's become, fast become one of the most riveting authors I have ever read. And I have read 2 books of the Century Trilogy, which kind of charts 5 families as they make their way through 100 years of world history across varying generations. I've fallen in love with those 2 books, and I kind of started the third. I put it on the back burner a little bit because I wanted to focus on other things before I dive into it, and I also didn't want to have like a reader burnout of just going from one to the next. So that's the only reason he's not in my top 10 yet. But man, those 2 books are fantastic, and that's not even known as his greatest work. People talk about his Kingsbridge series with Pillars of the Earth, which being one of the greatest novels of the 20th century from a lot of people's opinions. So of course, there's a lot more Ken Follett to be read, and I'm really looking forward to being able to change these numbers as the years go by. But for now, he's an honorable mention. The second honorable mention I wanted to mention is the author of The Dresden Files. Now, this is Jim Butcher. And I have fallen in love with his work as well. His is kind of a fantasy world that has really stayed with me in a lot of respects. And I've read now 7 books, I think. I'm going to be starting the 8th one around spooky season, around October. And I'm looking forward to kind of making my way through more of the series. So I'm really excited about that. And again, you're going to say, oh, you've read 7 books. You really like his work. Why isn't he in the top 10? Now, that's only specifically because there are 10 other authors that resonate with me that much more. And it's a hard list to make, honestly. So this is something that was not easy to put together, and I kind of wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, because sometimes you look at these authors and it's hard to decide. At some point I had to make a decision, and that's why Jim Butcher is an honorable mention for now. But as I make my way through more, I've heard book 12, I think, Changes is supposed to be his best work. So let's see how I feel about it in 2025. For now, Jim Butcher, Dresden Files author, honorable mention. The third honorable mention is an author that I have only read one book of so far, but I absolutely loved it. I mean, this is in one of those, fantasy series that I need to complete kind of a category. And that is none other than Tad Williams. Now, you may think about Tad Williams is very known for the Dragonbone Chair and the King of Osternaard series and things like that. But what actually made me fall in love with his work is reading the first book of the Otherland series. And I absolutely loved it. I mean, if you like, say, The Dark Tower by Stephen King, you're going to love Otherland, because it's very much a mashup of like historical fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, horror, all sorts of kind of elements in it. And it's very kind of prescient of the times, talking about AI, talking about, multiverses and like metaverses and living in those metaverses and things like that. So I just love his prose. I love his character descriptions, and I love the world building that he makes. So it's very unique. I'm looking forward to discovering more of his work. And so that was the third honorable mention. The fourth honorable mention, you can tell I have a lot of honorable mentions because they're all freaking fantastic. But the fourth one is one that I have been kind of reading on some read-alongs this year. So Robin Hobb, the author of the Realm of the Elderling series, a 16-book series that's divided into 4, trilogy subseries and then 1 quadrilogy. So quite a few books, but at least you can kind of break it up and go through read at your own pace, I guess you could say. And I have not read Robin Hobb's books under her other pseudonym, Megan Lindholm, so definitely want to check those out at some point as well. But I am on book 3 right now of her Farseer trilogy, which is the first trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings. I'm on a read-along right now with John from Disquiet and Dragons and Ellie from Bibbidi Bobbidi Books, and I freaking love it. I mean, her prose is so rich. It's so beautiful. The character descriptions, the fact that like they go through actual consequences and it's a gradual thing. It's not like everything, a victory and a failure feels earned, if that makes sense. And I just love her writing. I know she's going to go on a top 10 at some point. I just want to make my way more through the Realm of the Elderlings. And the fifth and final honorable mention is James Clavell. Now, James Clavell is the author of the Asian Saga, not to mention the first book, I guess, in the Asian Saga. I think it's the 4th one in the publication order, but the first one in terms of the timeline is Shogun. One of the greatest novels of the 20th century, definitely an all-timer for me as far as a novel. But I've only read the one, and I want to read more of his works, and I'm going to try to get to Taipan, I think the second book in that Asian Saga series, later on this year. And hopefully he will go on my top 10, but then that's just going to make it harder for me to do this top 10 in the first place. So without further ado, let's go to our top 10. So the first one in the top 10 list is Cixin Liu, the author of the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. Now, I've only read the trilogy so far, and that kind of hits my cutoff for the 3 books that I needed to read. But I gotta say, I read it during the pandemic, and it absolutely blew my mind. It is the most mind-bending sci-fi, most thought-provoking sci-fi I have ever read as a series so far. Nothing has come remotely close, and it felt like the first book, Three Body Problem, which is now a Netflix series, was mind-blowing alone. Then you look at the second book, and that beat out the first by a mile. Then you read the third book, and that, eclipses the second book by many degrees. So it is one of those series that I keep coming back to in my mind's eye. I keep thinking about, and it's something that I'm definitely going to be reading more of. I really want to read more of Cixin Liu's works, and I think Ken Liu was the author of the Dandelion Dynasty. I believe he was the translator on it, and he did such beautiful translations. So, Cixin Liu with assistance by Ken Liu is my number 10 pick. Number 9 is a fantasy author who would be called Lord Grimdark himself, the guy who has kind of pioneered the Grimdark genre and kind of taken it in new directions and become more of a character-focused author. And of course, I'm talking about Joe Abercrombie, the author of the First Law universe. So now, if you haven't read that, I highly recommend you do so, because there's a trilogy, 3 standalones, and a sequel trilogy. And I am on book 7 now, so that's the 3rd standalone. Or no, sorry, book 6. So I have absolutely adored every single one. And to my mind, they've gotten even better as you've gotten to know these characters, the side stories, the side characters. Every single character you meet is distinct. And it's to the point where you could read a piece of dialogue, not know who the character is, and instantly know who it is that is being referred to in the book. Very few authors can do that. You know, they can. Joe Abercrombie has the ability to make detestable characters likable, and then likable characters detestable. And it's a testament to the fact that they're all human. You know, they all have great and evil parts of them, and it's what they choose to enact on in that particular moment that defines kind of their character. And of course, that evolves over time too. Fascinating author, fascinating series. Highly recommend you check him out. Number 9, Joe Abercrombie. Number 8, I discovered this author a couple years ago through Mike from Mike's Book Reviews. Of course, I've discovered like half of my favorite authors through him, so big shout out to Mike. But this author, you know, is a fantasy author as well. People have said, if you like Joe Abercrombie, if you like, you know, Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, you might like this author. He writes books that are very fast-paced in that it feels very cinematic. There's a lot of deep lore, a lot of character development, and a lot of different characters. But it, you know, every chapter is 10 pages. It ends on a cliffhanger. It keeps you reading. And I remember the second book. I read it, then I read the third book. And I remember putting down that third book, and I had the fourth book with me in this quadrilogy, and I picked it up immediately, and I just started reading it because it was that addicting. And of course, I'm talking about John Gwynne. John Gwynne is the author of the Faithful and the Fallen series, and he had a sequel trilogy that came out after that quadrilogy, and now he has the Bloodsworn Saga. So I've read the first 7 books that he's written, which was the Faithful and the Fallen quadrilogy, and then the sequel trilogy. Both are amazing. And I've heard the Bloodsworn Saga is even better, so I know that I'm going to really enjoy that ride. And I'm going to be actually reading that with John from Disquieting Dragons as well, starting in September, then one in October, and the final one, Fury of the Gods, in November. So I'm really looking forward to checking that out, and he might even go up on my list at a later point. But that is number 8, and that is John Gwynne. Now, number 7. Let's talk about captivating, you know, sci-fi thrillers and techno thrillers and books that are, you know, are only a couple hundred pages long, but read so fast, you could read these in a couple sittings. I mean, they are that addicting. Yet, this author does not skimp on the incredible scientific aspects of it, and you could really go deep into that if you really choose to. He has been known as, you know, kind of carrying the torch of people like Michael Crichton, whose books in like the 80s and 90s defined pop culture films and TV. And that is, of course, Blake Crouch. So Blake Crouch, I have read several books of his. I have read Dark Matter, which is now a TV series, Recursion, which is, I think, in development, Upgrade, which was his newest work, and then I also read the Wayward Pines trilogy. I have loved all of them, probably equally. And, you know, what author could you really say that about? Because Wayward Pines was written like 10 years ago. These other 3 books were written in the last 5-6 years or so, the first ones I mentioned. And reading backward into his catalog, you would think like, okay, you're going to start to see it a little rough around the edges, but he is one of those authors that was fully formed even from back then, you know, and he was always writing captivating fiction and captivating thrillers, and makes you question, you know, kind of the nature of life. Because, you know, for example, Dark Matter has this idea of like, what if you wake up one day and your wife is not your wife and your son is not your son? Who are you before and who are you now? Are you real now? Were you real before? And how do you get back home? You know, that idea is just so captivating to me. So I love that kind of stuff. And I love being able to have books that are smaller after these dense fantasy books and things like that. And so, of course, number 7, I have to say, is my guy, Blake Crouch. Definitely check him out if you haven't yet. And honestly, any of those places I mentioned are really good places to start. You can't go wrong. Number 6. So sci-fi, getting into kind of sci-fantasy. If you want deep lore, if you want characters that are, you know, take place 20,000 years in the future, and you want to ask yourself the question, you know, if an Anakin Skywalker type character, not Anakin Skywalker, but a character like that, becoming a Darth Vader type character was for the good of mankind, for the good of the universe, what would that world look like? And that is, of course, Christopher Rocchio. Some of the most beautiful prose in the business, yet never sacrificing character development or pacing as a result. I never felt like his books dragged, but man, they get mind-melting. They get mind-melting. It is so dense. Yet, you always feel like you can't stop turning the pages. I mean, he just makes you, again, he makes you question kind of the nature of humanity. If humanity was to live for another 20,000 years, what would that look like through the lens of this kind of mythical and also controversial character, making the decisions that they make, in also reference to things that happened in our time, in their 20,000 years prior. Fascinating series in The Sun Eater. He has now written 6 books. The 7th book might come out, I think, later next year. And he's written a bunch of side stories. He's only like 30, 31 years old. He is the author to watch, in my opinion. Out of everybody on this list, he's the guy that's really going to continue to go places, I think. He's my number 6, Christopher Rocchio. Check him out. I'm linking his channel below as well, because he always has like really great reading updates on how he kind of, is going in his writing process. And he writes fast for how beautiful and dense these books are. So number 6, Christopher Rocchio. Number 5. Now, number 5, this author started my journey into fantasy entire. Now, in 2019, I had only read like The Hobbit, a little bit of Lord of the Rings, and I had read Harry Potter. I really liked it. Oh, I had also read Lion of the Witch in the Wardrobe. But this was over years and years, so I wasn't really used to fantasy, definitely not high fantasy with big lore. So I figured, why not start a 15-book series with like 2,800 characters? What could go wrong? And of course, I'm talking about The Wheel of Time. And the author is Robert Jordan. I fell in love with that world. I even wrote a piece that I recorded as an homage to it, and I recorded it with the Budapest Scoring Orchestra in Budapest, Hungary, and it led to me getting my job writing on season 2 of The Wheel of Time. It also opened my doors to everything from Jim Butcher to Abercrombie to George R. R. Martin and all these other fantasy authors. He's my gateway drug to fantasy. So I will always be grateful to Robert Jordan, his world building, his descriptions, sometimes a lot of descriptions, let's face the fact, but he had 15 books to do so, but he was just a fantastic, like some of the most unique world building I've ever seen. Some of the most unique magic system I've ever seen. So I would comfortably put Robert Jordan at number 5 on my list. Now, there is an author that was very influenced by Robert Jordan. He writes, even faster than Robert Jordan. And he has created an incredible universe where each kind of series and sub-series takes place on a different planet in his fictional universe. And I'm talking about Brandon Sanderson. Now, I've read the Mistborn trilogy, the Mistborn Era 2 quadrilogy. I've read the first 4 books in the Stormlight Archive. I read Warbreaker and Elantris. So I think I've read like 13 books of his. And I still am like halfway through or something. It's insane how fast he writes. But his magic systems are, second to none in my opinion. He really puts a lot of effort into hard magic systems with proper rules. And, I've never even been that big into that. I've tried that in other series and it's never really resonated with me like Brandon Sanderson's does. I think he's a master at that. I think he's a master at making us care about characters that are very flawed, but more flawed from an inner perspective, from an introspective, like some characters suffer from depression, some suffer from like a split personality disorder. It's about mental health as it applies to these characters. Phenomenal author. I could not recommend him highly enough. And honestly, you could read a book a month and he'll probably still never catch up because he writes faster than any author probably on this list. So I would recommend Brandon Sanderson if you haven't checked him out yet. But he is comfortably at my number 4. So now coming up to my top 3 authors of all time. If you like this list, I just want to let you know, please like and subscribe because I also want to, continue to make this a dialogue. Let me know what you think could be better about the channel. This is our channel, our collective experience, and I want it to be a good experience for all. So let me know in the comments what you like and what you don't like because I'm always going to improve this and always going to make it tailored to what you like. So without further ado, let's dive into the top 3. Now, the third one on this list was a recent find. So about this time last year, my friend and I made a pact to read every book in the Song of Ice and Fire series, knowing fully well that George R. R. Martin is probably never going to complete his series. And if he does, that would be a great bonus. But I'd heard such good things about these books that I figured, no matter what happens, let's just try it out. I'd already watched the Game of Thrones on TV, and so I kind of knew what the plot points were going to be. I was a little bit trepidous about trying a series like this because it's like, I know what's going to happen. Will it have the emotional gravitas knowing this? Well, let me tell you this. Yes. Short answer, yes. George R. R. Martin's writing is like nothing I've ever seen. I mean, his characters are the best in fantasy, in my opinion, my humble opinion. And I think he really makes you take these detestable characters, makes you care about them in the course of these 5 books that he's written so far in that universe. And I've never read anything like it that made me feel the way George R. R. Martin makes me feel for characters. His prose is so rich, you practically salivate. I'd mentioned in another video, you practically salivate from reading his words, both from just the beauty of the words and then also from the descriptions of the food. He is second to none in food descriptions, in my humble opinion. So, George R. R. Martin, number 3. If you've been holding off on a series until it's complete, I promise you, I implore you, please check it out. You will not regret it. I don't regret it, and I know you won't either. So, check out George R. R. Martin if you haven't already. I'm definitely going to check out more of his other works actually as well. I'd heard Fever Dream, I think, is a vampire novel. That would be interesting to check out. I want to see what else he's written in other universes as well. I think he's going to be another author that I really want to dive headfirst into. So that was number 3. Now, number 2, a slightly recent pick. I discovered him about a couple years ago, again through Mike from Mike's Book Reviews. I have read, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 novels, I think, so far, if I remember correctly. 4 novels, and 2 of them, the first 2 novels I read, would belong on my top 10 novels of all time in any genre, and that was 2 for 2. I just read them as a 1-2 punch. The first book I read of his was a coming-of-age story about a kid growing up in Zephyr, Alabama in the 1960s, witnessing the cultural touchstone of change as it occurred in the 60s and growing up around that time. There's a murder mystery as well. It's a bit thriller and suspenseful at times, but really it's a story of innocence about growing older and coming of age. If you like, let's say the movie The Sandlot, that's a really good analogy for kind of what this book makes you feel like. And one of the most tearjerker, beautiful, poetic endings of any book I've ever read. And then the second book I read was a post-apocalyptic book of his about a nuclear holocaust, the fallout, both literally and figuratively, and how society breaks down, and can society be redeemed after that. Brilliant author, and of course I'm talking about Robert McCammon. Now, if you like Stephen King or people like that, you are definitely going to love Robert McCammon. His character work is just phenomenal. He can write in different genres and make you care about the characters equally. I mean, I've never seen an author that could write a coming-of-age story and then a post-apocalyptic kind of like thriller and make you feel like, oh, these are on par with each other. Insane. And then the other book I read of his, Stinger, is kind of about like an alien invasion thing, but it's also really centered around this kind of small town. And you kind of get to know all the characters in the small town. Does that sound familiar? If you're a fan of Stephen King, very similar to that vibe. I also read Gone South, another very weird but interesting kind of like a cat and mouse kind of a book. So I highly recommend Robert McCammon if you haven't read him. I'm actually going to be doing probably his Matthew Corbett series sometime next year. Maybe I'll start the first book this year if I can. I'm thinking of doing a couple read-alongs on this channel. Jenny Wirtz, I talked about in another video. I was thinking about doing a read-along of hers, and I was thinking about doing a read-along of Matthew Corbett. So let me know in the comments if anything like that strikes your fancy, because I'm probably going to do a poll as well and kind of get your thoughts on that, so we can kind of pick one together to read as well. So that's my number 2. Now, number 1 is probably not surprising to most of you, because I've mentioned in almost every video that this guy is my favorite author of all time. I even have a whole shelf dedicated to the man back there, and I have a lot of content related to his works. Now, this guy wrote his first book in 1974 with Carrie. Famously, he wasn't happy with the draft, so he threw it in the trash. His wife Tabitha picked it up and convinced him to publish it, and the rest is history, if you believe the mythology around that. He has written stuff in horror, in sci-fi, in coming of age, in fantasy. He's talked about marriage dynamics. He's talked about the most random subjects, but you know what unites all of them? His depth of character work. He could be talking about Roland's plight to the Dark Tower and the most epic of multiverses. Or he could be talking for about 20 pages about an old lady behind a counter in a small town. And you care about the characters equally. It doesn't matter where they're from or where they're going. You're along for the ride. And of course, I'm talking about Stephen King. Stephen King is my guy. When I first read him, was kind of the first adult horror book I ever read, which was Pet Sematary when I was 13 years old. I started, he kind of made me discover my love of reading adult books in my early teenage years. And then I kind of took a break from reading in my 20s because I was kind of tired of like reading in college and then being forced to read, you know. And so I kind of rebelled against reading for a while. And I rediscovered reading through picking up his works. Shortly thereafter, reading the Dark Tower series, reading 11/22/63 about the JFK assassination, reading It, The Stand, The Shining, and the list goes on. I mean, you could throw a dart at any one of his books, you know, put it on a dartboard, throw it at any one of his books, and you're probably sure to hit a winner. Now, of course, he's not the perfect author. He's had a few duds, and he's sometimes has trouble sticking the landing. He does have pacing issues. But you know, I have found that some of his imperfections, I just love the way he writes so much that I kind of don't care. I know this is very biased of me to say, but sometimes it's kind of fun. The imperfections of The Dark Tower that have kind of gotten some people hung up about those later books, on a reread, I've really grown to appreciate those imperfections because it's just so Stephen King. You know, it's just him being himself. And that comes through in his writing. So I just love authors that are genuinely and authentically themselves. And he really makes me feel that way. So I just could keep gushing on and on about him, but I'm on a quest to read every Stephen King book he's ever written. I'm about 46 deep now. And I still got a ways to go. So I'm going to be doing, you know, on this channel one a month until I'm done. And then I might even do a reread of all of his books, you know, in publication order or something, make that a long-term project for the channel. So let me know if that kind of strikes your fancy also in the comments. So that was my top 10 authors of all time. I know this is a longer video, but I had a lot to say about each one of them. So thank you for joining me on this journey and for listening to me yap about my favorite authors for the last, you know, 27 minutes or so and some change. So I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. Let me know your top 10. Let's discover some more books and authors together. And in the meantime, please be good to yourselves. Please be good to each other. I will see you on the next one. Take care.